Welcome to Chess with Link. Today we're talking about the power of promoting your pawns. As we begin looking at our puzzles today, I'd like you to keep in mind that pawns, when you push them across the middle of the board, when you get them into your opponent's territory, they are incredibly powerful. They're one of the biggest threats on the chessboard if you guard them and if you promote them. So let's see what we can do in a series of 3 puzzles that come from the Lichess puzzle database and do a lovely job illustrating different methods of using our pawns in concert with other pieces to either get checkmate or gain a very strong advantage. For this particular puzzle, we have checkmate available to us very quickly, but we have to use our pieces together. Now, our opponent is in a corner, and we do have a pawn that could press forward and put our opponent in check right away. And if we push our pawn, the king would not even be able to capture it to defend himself because our knight is guarding. But what would we do next after that? Would the pawn press forward or capture? How would our opponent have responded to us putting them in check at g7? If you think you see it, see if your move matches what I'm about to do. I push my pawn forward to g7. My opponent has to move to h7. Now, why h7 and not g8? For the same reason that we're about to get checkmate. Do you see that long-range support all the way across the board from the bishop at a2? That supports our pawn's promotion square, allowing us to push our pawn to g8, promote it to a queen, and with the knight guarding h6 and the bishop guarding our queen, it's checkmate. All right, that was a bit of an easy one. Let's make this a little bit more complicated, starting with being in check. So if we're in check, what plan can we formulate to both get out of check and turn this around on our opponent? Notice that we're also in a fork, so if we just move our king, the knight is going to take our rook. If we capture the knight, then our opponent is going to take our pawn. But what could we do after that? With that e4 pawn gone, our rook would then be supporting our pawn at e6, which would then be only 2 squares from promotion, even if one of those squares is rather perilous. But if our opponent did capture our pawn using their queen, well, then we would take their queen with our rook and have a definitive advantage here in the endgame. So this may be our path. If the queen takes the knight, and our opponent takes back as predicted, we're safe to push our pawn forward. And while our opponent has now moved their queen to a spot where we will not be able to threaten her if we under-promoted to a knight. And she is even threatening our knight. We are now safe to press forward and promote. And while it's not checkmate, and we are possibly going to lose our knight, remember that our opponent cannot take our knight while they're in check, so they're going to have to move the king, which gives us the opportunity to check again with our queen, or move her to a good spot where she can defend that knight. We're in a much better position than we were just a couple turns ago. What do you say we simplify things a little bit more? Now, simplification on the chessboard doesn't necessarily mean that we're in a safer spot. Simplification just means that we're removing our opponent's pieces in even trades. What happens if we push our pawn forward? What happens if we capture with our queen? Let's push our pawn. And we see that our opponent moves the king. Why did they move their king? Simply because the queen was pinned by our queen. They couldn't move their queen at all. And now, do we want to capture the rook? Do we want to promote? Or do we want to capture the queen? All feel like solid options. But which one would give us the most long-term benefit? If we use our queen to capture our opponent's queen, they're going to take back. They kind of have to take back, otherwise we're going to be able to checkmate them. And that pulls their rook out of its defensive position and allows us to move our pawn forward and promote, gaining a virtually guaranteed path to victory. And in this case, we could see this path by starting with a threat on their queen. A threat to get rid of that queen. And then pull their rook out of its defending square. Because if they don't pull that rook up and take our queen, we're going to use our queen to checkmate them. Sometimes, even when we are in check, we can see our way through the pattern of pieces on the board and identify the exact sequence of moves which will allow us to force our opponent into a bad position, even if it requires a sacrifice. Because if we can promote our pawn and either get the queen or put them in check with that promotion by under-promoting, we can gain such an advantage that our opponent will be unable to recover. For example, here, if we use our pawn to capture at g7, that puts our opponent in check, so they are forced to respond. And they know that they're in a lot of trouble here. We don't have an instant checkmate, but we can simplify the board more. We can force our opponent to pull their pieces out of a good position. We can force them to capture one of our pieces in a way that is not beneficial to them. We may even be able to force a checkmate, if you can find it. Do you see it yet? I'm going to bring my rook up to f8. And our opponent captures with their rook. They can't capture with the king because the pawn is guarding. And they have to respond because they were in check. Do you see it now? With that rook off the board, our pawn can capture at f8. And notice the bishop over on h6 supporting. That means that we can then promote and find checkmate immediately. Folks, one of the great, glorious things about chess is that the humblest of pieces, the pawns, technically not even considered a piece when we're evaluating positions on the board. The gameplay pieces which are called a piece are just the queen, the knight, the rook, the bishop, and of course the king. The pawns are just pawns. But if we use those pawns correctly, and if we support them with rooks and bishops and queens and knights, we can press those pawns forward until they are promotable. And that promotion can often be the key to victory. Have a wonderful week, folks. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on pawn promotion, or if there were any alternative paths to victory in any of the puzzles that you saw here.